The fire in the hearth of the Mercer manor did not merely warm the room, it consumed dreams. The drawing room smelled of old cedar, expensive single malt scotch, and the suffocating weight of generational entitlement. Outside, the Massachusetts shoreline was being battered by an unyielding autumn gale, but inside, the atmosphere was frozen by a single corporate decree. Jacqueline Mercer stood motionless before her mother's mahogany desk, her boots unpolished but her spine rigid with a military posture she'd spent years refining in secret. She was 17, her hands calloused from tinkering with old flight engines at the local airfield, her eyes reflecting the sharp steel-gray coloration of the storm clouds outside. Eleanor Mercer did not look up from her ledger immediately. When she did, her eyes were cold, calculating, and completely devoid of maternal warmth. She held a thick, heavy envelope, embossed with the gold seal of the United States Military Academy's Aviation Division. It was the official notification that Jacqueline had not only passed the rigorous entry examinations but had finished as the valedictorian of the incoming class, securing a prestigious, fully funded combat aviation pilot scholarship. "Do you know what you are, Jacqueline?" Eleanor asked, her voice smooth, low, and terrifyingly sharp. "You are a bad investment. For 17 years, I have poured capital into your education, your deportment, and your social presentation. And your return to this family is a piece of government paper declaring your intent to become a mechanic in the sky." Before Jacqueline could answer, Eleanor leaned forward and tossed the acceptance packet into the roaring flames of the fireplace. The thick parchment curled, blackened, and dissolved into ash within seconds. "You are a woman, Jacqueline," Eleanor declared, her tone absolute. "Your purpose is to marry into a lineage that expands the Mercer influence. Your body and your name belong to the legacy of this house, the board of directors, the chairmanship, and the entirety of the Mercer. Holdings are reserved for your sister, Vivienne. You will attend the finishing schools we have. Selected, you will accept a marriage alliance, or you will exist as nothing more than a ghost in our balance sheets." The rain came down in sheets at midnight when Jacqueline left. She did not cry, nor did she look back at the grand columns of the Mercer estate. Over her shoulders hung 2 coarse, military-grade canvas duffel bags she had bought with cash earned from working hidden shifts at the commercial docks. They contained nothing but a few changes of rugged clothes, her grandfather's old pilot logs, and a determination that had been forged in the embers of her mother's fireplace. The transition into the military was not a refuge. It was a refinery of bone and spirit. At Fort Frucker, Alabama, the instructors sought to break the upper-class vanity out of every cadet, but they found nothing in Jacqueline to break. She had already been stripped of her illusions by her own blood. While the other candidates slept during the rare 6-hour windows of rest, Jacqueline remained in the darkened simulators memorizing the blind layouts of cockpit instrument panels until she could operate every toggle by feel alone. The night tactical flight training was designed to induce raw panic. Flying beneath a completely dark canopy with night vision goggles that limited peripheral awareness to a grainy blur, she learned to read the air like a living entity. The G-forces compressed her lungs, and the relentless pressure of low-altitude terrain masking maneuvers made her chest feel as though it were being torn open from the inside. "Mercer doesn't bleed," her flight instructor, a hardened combat veteran of 30 years, muttered during a grueling tactical evaluation. "She flies like she has a grudge against gravity itself. She doesn't just pass the stress limits, she lives past them." She graduated at the absolute top of her class, completely bypassing the standard transport tracks to be assigned to the elite heavy-lift special operations aviation units destined for the most volatile sectors of the Middle East. October 12, 2022, 6:315 hours. EST African border. Africation Desert Phantom. The twin Lycoming T-55 GA-714A turboshaft engines of the CH-47 Chinook heavy-lift helicopter screamed as the massive aircraft hovered in the dead space between 2 jagged desert ridges. The air was thick with the smell of hydraulic fluid, burning sulfur, and the concussive shock waves of anti-aircraft artillery exploding in the valley below. Chief Warrant Officer 2, Jacqueline Mercer, held the cyclic control stick with hands that were perfectly steady, her heart rate locked at a calm, deliberate baseline despite the chaos illuminating her heads-up display. An elite Tier 1 special operations team had been compromised on the valley floor completely, surrounded by a heavily armed militant brigade equipped with Russian-made anti-aircraft batteries. The primary evacuation route was completely sealed by a wall of thermal fire, and the surrounding airspace had been declared a no-fly zone for conventional aircraft. "We're taking fire from the ridge. Port side, port side." The crew chief screamed over the internal comms as a heavy barrage of 12.7mm rounds punched through the aluminum skin of the fuselage. The instrument panel flared into a violent cascade of warning lights. Engine 1 fail. Hydraulic, a few high D pressure critical. The massive helicopter shuddered violently at its nose, dipping as half of its total lift capacity evaporated in an instant. The secondary rotor began to lose synchronization, threatening to tear the entire airframe apart through catastrophic structural vibration. "Hold on," Jacqueline commanded, her voice cutting through the alarms with absolute authority. Instead of pulling away from the danger zone, she slammed the collective down, utilizing the remaining engine's emergency power to pitch the burning 40,000-pound aircraft into a terrifying high-speed dive straight through the network of anti-aircraft tracer lines. She used the terrain-masking shadows of the cliffs to shelter the crippled Chinook, bringing the heavy rear ramp down into the burning sand just meters away from the pinned-down Special Forces unit. The extraction took less than 90 seconds of absolute unadulterated hell. With the interior cargo bay covered in shrapnel damage and one engine completely dead, Jacqueline managed to lift the overloaded Chinook out of the valley, steering through a gauntlet of mortar geysers by sheer intuition and an iron will. She brought the aircraft back to a forward operating base with 0 casualties among the rescued special operators, landing on a single operational landing gear as the remaining engine finally seized and died. 3 months later, a ceremony took place inside a secure, windowless office within the restricted corridors of the Pentagon. There were no cameras, no press releases, and no family members present. The Secretary of the Air Force pinned the Air Force Cross, the nation's second highest award for extraordinary heroism in combat, to Jacqueline's crisp, midnight blue uniform. This citation is classified under the Black Budget OS2 protocol. Chief Warrant Officer Mercer, the general said, his eyes reflecting a deep professional respect. "Your actions saved 12 elite operators, but officially, this operation never occurred. Your public service record will show nothing more than a standard logistics assignment at a supply depot in Washington." "The sky knows what I did, sir," Jacqueline replied smoothly, saluting before turning on her heel. The next week, during a brief 48-hour leave, Jacqueline returned to Massachusetts. Standing on the periphery of the Mercer mansion during the family's annual autumn corporate gala, she wore her service uniform, but her chest bore only the standard unclassified ribbons permitted by the public registry. To the wealthy elite in attendance, she looked like nothing more than a low-level bureaucrat. Eleanor Mercer approached her, her eyes scanning the uniform with an expression of profound aristocratic dismissal. "So, you've returned from your little clerk job in Washington," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Your sister Vivian has just secured a $500 million tech acquisition. She moves the markets of the world. And you spend your days counting inventory in a warehouse. You threw away our name to be a servant to people who don't even know you exist." Jacqueline looked at her mother's immaculate, unblemished hands, then down at her own fingers, which still bore the faint chemical scars of aviation fuel and the memory of a burning cockpit. She didn't feel anger. She felt nothing but a vast, sky-deep clarity. "You're right, Mother," Jacqueline said softly, her voice carrying the terrifying, unyielding calm of a pilot who had stared down a missile track and refused to blink. "You have absolutely no idea what I do, and you never will." The Grand Plaza Savannah's ballroom was a masterclass in gilded decadence. Beneath the cascading crystal chandeliers, Georgia's old money and defense contract aristocracy mingled in a sea of tailored tuxedos and silk gowns. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars, imported champagne, and the distinct metallic tang of predatory capitalism. At the center of the social solar system sat the VIP table of Vance Global Logistics. Eleanor Vance, Jacqueline's biological mother, sat draped in emerald silk, her diamonds catching the light with every practiced artificial laugh. Beside her was Thomas Vance, the stepfather whose political maneuvering had built an empire on the backs of shell companies and government subsidies. Completing the triumvirate was Vivienne, Jacqueline's elder sister, radiating the smug, effortless cruelty of someone who had never had to bleed for a single dollar in her life. Sitting adjacent to them, adjusting his gold cufflinks with a sickeningly smug grin, was Arthur Lawson, the family's chief legal architect. "She's late," Thomas muttered, checking his platinum Patek Philippe. Typical. No sense of corporate discipline. "Oh, relax, Thomas," Vivienne cooed, swirling a glass of vintage Dom Perignon. "Our little Jackie is probably still trying to figure out how to park whatever government-issued eyesore she drove here. You can take the girl out of the swamp, but you can't teach her how to navigate high society." Eleanor sighed, a theatrical display of maternal exhaustion. "I just hope she doesn't embarrass us. The Undersecretary of Defense is only 3 tables over. We need this logistics contract secured by midnight, or the creditors will start looking into the Savannah riverfront accounts." "Don't worry, Eleanor," Lawson whispered, tapping a thick, leather-bound folder on the table. "The paperwork is ready. By the time she realizes she's been checkmated, her signature will already be dry." The heavy, oak double doors of the ballroom didn't just open. They felt as though they were breached. The ambient chatter of the room dipped noticeability as Jacqueline stepped across the threshold. She didn't blend into the room, she severed it. She wore her Air Force service dress uniform, a deep, flawless midnight blue. The fabric was pressed to razor-sharp perfection. Across her left breast, rows of ribbon decorations and commendation bars formed a colorful, formidable mosaic of a lifetime spent in theaters of war. The civilians in this room could only glimpse on sanitized news broadcasts, but it was her footwear that drew the whispered scoffs from the surrounding tables. Instead of the mandatory high-heeled pumps expected at a formal gala, Jacqueline wore her combat boots. They were scuffed, weathered black leather, scarred by the gravel of foreign tarmacs and the grease of cargo bays. Every step she took echoed with a heavy, unyielding thud against the polished marble floor. She walked with a terrifyingly calm cadence, a lone dreadnought cutting through a sea of silken yachts. As she approached the VIP table, Vivienne's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before hardening into a sneer. Thomas looked at her boots with visceral disgust, while Eleanor immediately masked her disdain with a look of practiced, tragic longing. Jacqueline stopped precisely 2 paces from the table. She didn't pull out a chair. She simply stood, her posture rigid, her eyes completely devoid of warmth. "Sit down, Jacqueline," Thomas commanded, his voice low and gravelly. "You're making a scene." Jacqueline remained standing. "I am on official duty hours until 2400. State your business, Thomas." Lawson chuckled, a dry, raspy sound as he leaned back in his leather chair. "Still playing the stoic soldier, I see. Let's cut the bureaucratic theatrics, Captain. You sit in a comfortable, air-conditioned office in Washington, drawing a bloated administrative salary funded by taxpayers, while your family actually does the heavy lifting of running a national enterprise." Vivienne took a slow sip of her champagne, leaning forward to look up at her sister. "Lawson is right, Jackie. You're just a glorified desk jockey. You sign a few inventory manifests, authorize a couple of warehouse transfers, and pretend you're serving the country. Meanwhile, we are the ones navigating the actual cash flows. We keep the wheels turning while you play soldier." Jacqueline didn't blink. Beneath her uniform jacket, her tactical watch silently monitored her vitals. Biometric log 2114 EST, heart rate 60 BPM, respiration 12 breaths/min, status nominal/ice, 15 years. Vivienne continued, her voice dripping with venom. 15 years of utter ungratefulness. You vanished into the military, leaving us to handle the fallout of your absence. And now, Vance Global is facing a temporary liquidity crunch because of the delays in the Department of Defense logistics pipeline. It's time to pay your debts. Lawson slid the leather folder across the white tablecloth, stopping it right before Jacqueline's gloved hands. This is a deed of immediate transfer for the Savannah riverfront estate, Lawson said smoothly, handing her a sleek Mont Blanc pen. The property is currently in your name, a legacy asset from your grandfather. We require you to sign it over to Vance Global Logistics tonight. Consider it a mandatory tax for your 15 years of filial disrespect. Sign it, and we forget your insolence. Jacqueline looked down at the paper. She didn't touch the pen. The silence stretching between them became so heavy that even the neighboring tables began to glance over. Eleanor's face contorted. In an instant, the poised matriarch vanished, replaced by a desperate feral predator trapped in silk. She slammed her manicured hand down on the table, rattling the crystal stemware. Look at me when I'm speaking to you, Eleanor hissed, tears suddenly welling up in her eyes, perfect engineered tears that she had used for decades to manipulate boardrooms and husbands alike. How can you be so cold? I carried you for 9 months. We gave you everything and you treat us like strangers. You stand there in your arrogant little suit looking down on the family that made you. Thomas leaned in, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. You listen to me, girl. You sign that paper tonight. If you walk out of this room without signing, I will personally call General Murdoch. I will leak a story to the Washington Post about how an Air Force captain is using her administrative position to financially strangle her own family's defense firm. We will drag your name through the mud so thoroughly you'll be court-martialed before the week is out. Vivienne smiled maliciously, raising her glass in a mocking toast. Sign the paper, Jackie. Go back to your little desk. Let the adults handle the real world. Jacqueline remained perfectly still. The insults, the threats, the emotional blackmail, it all washed over her like water against a battleship's hull. She watched Eleanor's fake tears dry instantly under the glare of her own anger. She watched Thomas's veins bulge in his neck. She watched Lawson's arrogant, self-satisfied grin. They thought they had her cornered. They thought they were dragging her to the slaughterhouse. They had no idea they had just walked willingly into her kill zone. Jacqueline checked her watch. 21:20. The trap was set and the parasites had just tightened the noose around their own necks. The atmosphere inside the high-security federal hearing room adjacent to the Grand Plaza felt like a vacuum chamber. The opulent golden warmth of the ballroom had been replaced by sterile fluorescent lighting, polished mahogany panels, and the suffocating presence of federal marshals standing like sentinels at the doors. At the elevated bench sat Federal Judge Arthur Sterling, who also served as the chairman of the Defense Procurement Oversight Committee. A man of unyielding reputation, Sterling's hair was a stark silver, his eyes sharp as flint. On the left side of the room, the Vance family sat like a row of preening vultures. Thomas leaned back, confidently adjusting his tie. Lawson smirked, his leather briefcase open, exposing the unsigned deed to Jacqueline's riverfront estate. Vivienne sneered openly across the aisle at Jacqueline, whispering to her mother. She brought a digital encryption drive, still playing with her toys while the ship sinks. Judge Sterling cleared his throat, the sound like cracking ice. This court is now in executive session to review the emergency injunction filed by Vance Global Logistics regarding the pending procurement freeze. Counselor Lawson, you have the floor. Lawson stood smoothly, buttoning his tailored suit jacket. Your Honor, our petition is simple. Vance Global is facing predatory bureaucratic delays caused by the Logistics Command in Washington. Furthermore, we have verified that a low-level administrative officer, Captain Jacqueline Mercer, who sits right across from us, has deliberately slowed down our supply chain compliance clearances due to a personal, vindictive family grudge. We are here to demand the immediate release of our frozen assets and to compel the transfer of a securing property asset to stabilize our corporate line of credit. Judge Sterling didn't look at Lawson. His eyes were fixed on the secure, heavily encrypted federal tablet embedded into his bench. A highly restricted file with a deceptive bare-bones designation had just popped up onto his screen. Operation Dost Fensics Logistics DocX. As the judge's biometric thumbprint bypassed the triple-layer firewall, the document unspooled. Sterling's posture went entirely rigid. The casual, authoritative boredom on his face vanished, replaced by a sudden, deathly paleness. His eyes widened, darting across the text, tracking the operational security clearances, the classified service records, and the true identity tied to the digital signature buried deep within the metadata. Name: Jacqueline Mercer. Rank: Colonel, United States Air Force. Call sign: Phoenix 01. Status: Special Liaison to the Defense Intelligence Agency (DISI) and Director of High-Risk Procurement Audit. The captain insignia on her shoulders wasn't her rank. It was her active, deep-cover operational layer while restructuring the corrupt domestic defense networks. Thomas chuckled under his breath, leaning toward Eleanor. Look at the judge. He's disgusted by her. It's over. They didn't know that Judge Sterling's hands were visibly shaking. Your Honor? Lawson prompted, his voice oozing a polite but patronizing impatience. Should we present the property deed for Captain Mercer's signature now? Judge Sterling didn't answer Lawson. Instead, he slowly pushed his chair back. His gaze locked onto Jacqueline, who sat perfectly still, her hands resting calmly on the table, her pulse still holding an unbreakable 60 beats per minute. The judge stood up. It wasn't the standard movement of a magistrate commanding a room. It was the sharp, instinctual reaction of a man confronted by a living legend. Before the paralyzed gaze of the entire room, the 60-year-old federal judge stepped down from the elevated bench. He didn't look at Thomas. He didn't look at Lawson. He walked directly to the defense table, stopped exactly 2 paces from Jacqueline, and brought his right hand up to his brow in a crisp, flawlessly executed military salute. His arm trembled slightly with an overwhelming surge of raw emotion. Colonel Mercer. Judge Sterling's voice cracked, thick with a profound, unspoken reverence that sent a violent shockwave through the room. The court and the United States of America stand at your command. Stand at your command. What is the meaning of this? Thomas stammered, leaping to his feet, his face flushing crimson. Your Honor, she is a captain, a rogue administrative clerk. Why are you saluting her? Shut your mouth, Thomas. Sterling roared, turning a gaze of pure fury upon the older man. The judge's voice echoed off the wood-paneled walls like thunder. You stand in the presence of the officer who commanded the extraction at the Sengin Valley in 2022. You stand in front of Phoenix 01. Sterling turned back to Jacqueline, his eyes glistening with tears that were entirely real. My son, Captain Marcus Sterling, was the commander of the forward operating base that was completely cut off by enemy fire. He and his entire platoon were marked as acceptable casualties by the Pentagon. They were left to die. It was this woman, this colonel, who overrode a direct stand-down order, personally flew the lead extraction gunship through an active air defense umbrella, and brought all 32 of my son's men home alive. The room fell into a terrifying, dead silence. Vivienne's mouth dropped open, her champagne-fueled arrogance evaporating instantly. Eleanor clutched her pearl necklace so tightly the string threatened to snap, her eyes darting from the saluting judge to her youngest daughter, who hadn't even shifted her posture. At ease, Judge Sterling, Jacqueline said softly. Her voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a terrifying, absolute authority that commanded the room. Please resume your bench. The audit is ready to commence. The defense is ready to present the financial and criminal evidence regarding the plaintiff's systemic fraud, announced Major Harrison, Jacqueline's legal representative, stepping forward and opening a military-grade secure laptop. With a single keystroke, the massive projector screens on the wall flickered to life. A vast, intricate web of financial transactions, tax records, and wire transfers illuminated the dim room, bathed in a cold, blue light. Let the records show, Major Harrison spoke with a rhythmic, devastating clarity, that the narrative of Jacqueline Mercer being an ungrateful, broke, and absent daughter is a carefully fabricated corporate myth used to psychologically leverage her assets. The first document flashed on the screen. Enter now Revenue Servant. Notice of Levy and Tax Lien, 219. In November of 2019, Major Harrison stated, pointing to the encrypted data fields, Vance Global Logistics faced a catastrophic federal tax evasion charge. Eleanor Vance was personally facing an active federal arrest warrant for a $50,000 fraudulent deduction scheme. The individual who saved her from a federal penitentiary was not her husband Thomas, nor her eldest daughter Vivienne. It was Jacqueline Mercer. The screen zoomed in on a wire transfer originating from a military banking institution. Colonel Mercer utilized her cumulative hazard pay and combat deployment bonuses earned while taking shrapnel in Eastern Europe to secretly execute an anonymous structural bailout. She paid the $50,000. She kept her biological mother out of a prison jumpsuit. And she never said a word, allowing Eleanor to believe it was a clerical error. Eleanor's face drained of color. She looked at the screen, her lips trembling. No, that can't be. Thomas told me he settled that. Thomas used that $50,000 to buy a speedboat in Miami, ma'am. Major Harrison corrected coldly, transitioning to the next slide. Stating of Ohio v. Via V and Een, Vance. Fraudulent Secro and securities violation, 22-2. 2 years later, the Major continued, his voice dripping with professional disdain. Vivienne Vance engaged in a predatory real estate scam in Columbus, Ohio, resulting in a court-ordered asset forfeiture and a massive civil fraud penalty. To prevent a public scandal that would destroy Vance Global's defense bidding status, Colonel Mercer authorized a blind disbursement from her grandfather's legacy trust fund. She covered the penalty. She bought your silence, Vivienne. She bought your freedom. Vivienne sat paralyzed, her eyes pinned to her own signature on the Ohio court settlement. Next to the routing numbers of the trust fund she had just claimed Jacqueline was uselessly hoarding. For 15 years, Major Harrison concluded, turning to face the trembling family, you have lived on the blood money of the soldier you despised. You did not build an empire. You simply bled her dry from afar, completely oblivious to the fact that her shadow was the only thing keeping you out of a federal cage. Lawson desperately tried to salvage his position, his voice rising in panic. Your Honor, this is a domestic dispute. It has no bearing on the validity of the current defense procurement contract. Vance Global is offering a multi-million-dollar riverfront estate as collateral to secure the Alloy Logistics tender. The business is sound. The business is a criminal enterprise, Jacqueline spoke. She stood up. The silence that followed her movement was absolute. She tapped her terminal screen and the document, Operation Un. Sleaze. Bleeming. Sleemingus. Weemingus. Un. Executed its terminal command sequence across the Federal Defense Network. The riverfront estate you have spent the last 3 hours attempting to extort from me, Jacqueline said, looking directly into Vivienne's panicked eyes, was intended to be used as collateral for your new supply contract with the Department of Defense. A contract to supply high-grade titanium and aerospace alloys for the next generation of fighter airframes. She leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the table. 3 weeks ago, the Defense Criminal Investigative Service, DCIS, intercepted a shipment at the port of Savannah. The alloy your company, Vance Global, imported from a black market supplier in Eastern Europe was not aerospace-grade titanium. It was a cheap, structurally flawed counterfeit and alloy that would fracture under supersonic stress, sending American pilots to their deaths. Thomas choked on his own breath, his hands shaking violently as he gripped the edge of the table. That's the logistical mistake, an unverified subcontractor. You signed the verification manifest yourself, Thomas, Jacqueline whispered, her voice a chilling promise of doom. And Vivienne authorized the payment to the shell company in the Cayman Islands. On the massive projector screen, the docs file executed its final, irreversible macro. The word terminated appeared in massive blood-red block letters across the Vance Global Logistics corporate profile. Directly beneath it, an automated network command line began to scroll at lightning speed. DCIS command. Freeze all 6-dit HSX was. User wine thigh behind. 6er11 Corlo, Mercer car. Pentagon use logistics. Revol Kier procurement use legends. Effective. Immediately. Federal Reserve. Sized Ixi counts Vance Dots Global Logologistisk. The document docs isn't just an audit report, Thomas, Jacqueline said, her eyes flashing with the cold brilliance of a supernova. It is an automated top-tier executive warrant. As of exactly 60 seconds ago, your corporate network has been completely severed from the United States military infrastructure. Your bank accounts are frozen, your assets are seized by the federal government, and Vance Global Logistics is officially dead. The heavy oak doors of the hearing room flew open. 6 federal marshals, flanked by specialized agents from the Defense Criminal Investigative Service in tactical vests, poured into the room. Thomas Vance. Vivian Vance. Arthur Lawson, the lead agent announced, drawing a set of heavy steel handcuffs. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit major fraud against the United States, grand larceny, and treasonous endangerment of military personnel. Vivian screamed as a marshal grabbed her wrists, forcing her hands behind her back. The champagne glass she was holding shattered against the floor, puddling around her expensive designer heels. Thomas collapsed backward into his chair, his chest heaving, his face completely gray as the reality of absolute ruin set in. Eleanor fell to her knees before Jacqueline, her fake tears now replaced by a horrific, guttural panic. Jacqueline, please! I am your mother! You can't do this to us! You can't destroy your own family! Jacqueline looked down at her biological mother. She checked her watch one last time. 21:30. Her heart rate was still a perfectly steady, unyielding 60 beats per minute. You died to me 15 years ago, Eleanor, Jacqueline said coldly, turning her back on them as the marshals began dragging them out in chains. Tonight, I simply collected the bill. The metallic click of the federal marshal's handcuffs echoed through the sterile air of the hearing room like a volley of small arms fire. For Arthur Lawson, a man whose entire lucrative career had been built on navigating the gray, corrupt margins of corporate defense law, that sound was the final, definitive whistle of a game he had catastrophically lost. He didn't look at Thomas. He didn't look at Eleanor. His slick, analytical mind, completely stripped of its previous smugness, was already calculating the years of federal penitentiary time attached to a Grade 1 defense procurement fraud indictment. With frantic, trembling hands, Lawson began shoving his folders back into his premium leather briefcase. The elegant Montblanc pen he had offered Jacqueline only minutes earlier was dropped carelessly onto the mahogany table, rolling aimlessly until it hit a puddle of spilled water. Lawson, what are you doing? Thomas choked out, his voice cracking as a heavy-set marshal stepped behind his chair. Fix this. Call the federal district attorney. We pay you $3 million a year to handle bureaucratic overreach. There is no fixing this, Thomas, Lawson hissed. His face pale, sweat breaking out along his receding hairline. He refused to even make eye contact with the older man. You lied to me. You told me she was a low-tier logistics clerk in Washington. You failed to disclose that your entire supply chain was under active investigation by the Strategic Air Command and the DIA. Lawson turned sharply toward Judge Sterling, holding his hands up in a gesture of total surrender. Your Honor, let the record reflect that Lawson and Associates hereby immediately withdraws as legal counsel for Vance Global Logistics and all its subsidiaries. I am formally severing all professional ties with the Vance family, effective immediately. My firm had zero knowledge of the counterfeit alloy substitution. We were presented with falsified compliance certificates by Vivian Vance. You coward! Vivian screamed, her voice cracking into a shrill, hysterical screech as a female marshal secured the steel cuffs around her wrists. You helped us set up the offshore shell accounts in Grand Cayman. You took a 7% cut of the titanium procurement margins. I took a legal retainer for corporate restructuring, Lawson shot back. his voice trembling as he backed toward the exit doors, keeping his hands visible to the armed security personnel. Any criminal actions undertaken by the Executive Board of Vance Global were done without my legal authorization or counsel. Colonel Mercer, Judge Sterling. I am fully prepared to cooperate with the Department of Justice. I will hand over all corporate servers, encrypted financial ledgers, and communication logs dating back to 2019. Jacqueline didn't look at him. She didn't have to. The automated traps hidden within the Operation-Porson and Stash Logistics DocX file had already mirrored Lawson's private email servers and personal bank accounts 3 hours before he even walked into the Grand Plaza. He was running directly into a different cell of the same cage, thinking he was escaping. "Step aside, counselor," the lead DCIS agent commanded coldly, brushing past the panicked lawyer. Lawson didn't need to be told twice. He slipped out of the side exit like a shadow, leaving the family he had helped create to face the full, unmitigated wrath of the federal government alone. With their legal shield completely shattered, the reality of absolute structural ruin descended upon the Vance family table like a physical weight. Vivienne, whose entire identity was built on an artificial foundation of inherited wealth, designer labels, and social superiority, completely disintegrated. The fierce, venomous glare she directed at Jacqueline for the last 15 years morphed into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. As the marshal applied downward pressure on her shoulder to guide her out of her seat, Vivienne's knees simply buckled. She collapsed heavily onto the polished floor, her expensive emerald silk dress twisting around her legs. The pristine white tablecloth was dragged down with her, sending crystal wine glasses, silver cutlery, and the unsigned riverfront property deed crashing into a chaotic heap around her. "Get your hands off me," Vivienne shrieked, her manicured nails clawing at the sterile floor tiles as she tried to pull away from the law enforcement officers. "Do you know who I am? I am the Executive Vice President of Vance Global. You can't touch me. This is a mistake. It was a supplier error. Jacqueline, tell them it's a clerical mistake." "Stand up, Ms. Vance," the female marshal ordered, her voice completely devoid of emotion as she effortlessly hoisted Vivienne back to her feet. "You are being detained under Title 18, United States Code, Section 1031, for major fraud against the United States. Anything you say can and will be used against you." Thomas Vance sat frozen, looking 10 years older than he had 5 minutes ago. The flush of anger that had reddened his neck had faded into a sickly ash-gray complexion. His breathing was shallow and rapid. He stared at the massive projector screen where his company's entire legacy was being systematically wiped from the federal procurement grid in real time. 15 years. Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible over his stepdaughter's hysterical sobbing. "Everything we built. Gone in 60 seconds. "You didn't build anything, Thomas," Jacqueline said, her voice cutting through the chaos of the room with razor-sharp clarity. She stood at the head of the table, looking down at the broken remnants of her family. "You leased an illusion, and you paid for it with the lives of the soldiers you tried to cheat." Eleanor Vance looked at her youngest daughter, her eyes wide with a horrific, sudden realization. The child she had cast aside as a failure, the daughter she had mocked as a glorified desk jockey to her high society friends, was not a victim begging for maternal validation. She was the architect of their destruction. She held the absolute power of life and death over their entire world, and she had exercised it with the cold, calculated precision of a sniper. The doors to the main ballroom remained closed, but the muffled sounds of the federal raid were already leaking through the walls. The old money elites of Savannah, the senators, the defense contractors, and the military elite who had gathered to celebrate were now watching in stunned silence as military police guarded the exits of the Grand Plaza. Inside the hearing room, Eleanor fell to her knees. The emerald silk of her gown smeared against the spilled champagne on the floor, but she no longer cared about her appearance. The carefully cultivated poise of the Vance matriarch was completely dead, replaced by the raw, primal desperation of a parasitic organism realizing its host had turned toxic. She reached out, her diamond-encrusted fingers trembling as she tried to grasp the hem of Jacqueline's pristine Air Force uniform trouser leg. "Jacqueline, Jacqueline, please, Eleanor sobbed, real tears finally breaking through her heavy makeup, leaving dark streaks down her face. I am your mother, your biological mother. I gave you life. You cannot do this to us. You cannot let them take Vivian to a federal prison. She wouldn't survive a week in there. Jacqueline took a single, deliberate step back, pulling her boot away from Eleanor's reaching hands. The weathered, scuffed black leather of her combat boots contrasted sharply with the expensive silk and spilled champagne on the floor. When I was deployed to the tribal border regions in 2018, Jacqueline said, her voice dropping to a low, resonant register that vibrated through the small room, my transport convoy took a direct hit from an improvised explosive device. I sustained deep shrapnel wounds to my right shoulder and lost 2 liters of blood before the medical evacuation team could reach us. Eleanor blinked up at her, confused by the sudden tactical recollection. What? What does that have to do with this? Jacqueline, we are talking about your sister. While I was in the intensive care unit at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany, Jacqueline continued, completely ignoring the interruption, the hospital tracking system flagged an incoming emergency communication from Savannah. The doctors thought it was a family member calling to check on my survival status. Do you remember what that communication was, Eleanor? Eleanor shifted uncomfortably on her knees, her eyes darting away, her silence confirming her guilt. It wasn't a call from a mother, Jacqueline said, her eyes narrowing into cold slits of obsidian. It was a formal legal demand from your corporate attorney authorized by your signature. You were demanding that I execute a power of attorney transfer from my grandfather's trust fund because you were worried my potential death would freeze the family's secondary line of credit. I was bleeding on a steel table in Germany and your only concern was how to monetize my corpse. We were desperate. Eleanor cried out, her hands clutching at her own chest as she rocked back on her heels. The markets were crashing, and Thomas had made bad investments. We did what we had to do to survive. Families make mistakes, Jacqueline. But we are still blood. You have to forgive us. Blood is a biological component, Eleanor, Jacqueline replied coldly. It is not a blank check for treason. Thomas suddenly slammed his hands down on his table, his handcuffs rattling violently. You arrogant little bitch! You think you're untouchable just because you have a bird on your shoulder? You're an Air Force officer. You answer to the chain of command. I know the Undersecretary of Defense. He is sitting right outside that door in the main ballroom. I have contributed millions of dollars to his political action committees. Thomas glared at Jacqueline, his jaw clenching. All it takes is one phone call from him to the Chief of Staff at the Pentagon, and your career is finished. They will strip you of your rank, revoke your security clearances, and throw you into a military brig for abusing your authority to settle a personal family vendetta. A low, dark chuckle echoed from the back of the room. Judge Sterling stepped forward from his bench, looking down at Thomas with a mixture of pity and profound disgust. You truly are blind, aren't you, Thomas? You still don't understand the tier of authority you are dealing with. The judge tapped his secure federal terminal, projecting a highly classified document header onto the main wall. The document bore the gold-embossed seal of the White House and the Department of Defense Joint Chiefs of Staff. Colonel Mercer does not answer to the political appointees you buy over dinner, Mr. Vance, Judge Sterling stated with immense satisfaction. 6 months ago, the President of the United States signed an executive directive appointing Phoenix 01 as the autonomous director of the high-risk procurement task force. She possesses ultimate, unreviewable authority over all domestic defense logistics infrastructure. She doesn't need to ask the Pentagon for permission. The judge looked at Jacqueline, giving her a respectful nod. The Pentagon asks her for permission. Thomas's jaw dropped. The last remnants of his defiance evaporated, leaving him completely hollowed out. The political connections he had spent 30 years cultivating were completely useless against a woman who answered directly to the highest tier of national security infrastructure. Eleanor looked up at Jacqueline, her expression desperate. Jacqueline, please, just make one call. Just call the Pentagon and tell them there was an administrative error with the titanium shipment. Tell them we will replace it with the proper alloy immediately. We will sell the riverfront estate and give you all the proceeds. You can have everything, Jackie. Just save your sister. Save your family." Jacqueline stood perfectly straight. She reached up with her left hand, adjusting the alignment of her service cap. The gold-braided clouds and lightning bolts, the farts and darts of a senior military officer, glinted under the fluorescent lights, casting a sharp shadow over her eyes. "I don't negotiate with parasites in tailored suits, Eleanor," Jacqueline said. Her voice was completely flat, devoid of anger, sadness, or regret. It was the voice of an executioner reading a final verdict. "For 15 years you have viewed my service as an inconvenience, a joke, and a resource to be plundered," Jacqueline continued, looking down at the broken matriarch on the floor. "You took my hazard pay to cover your tax fraud. You took my grandfather's trust to pay for Vivian's criminal settlements. And all the while, you treated me like an outsider who was beneath your social standing." She took a slow, deep breath, her chest rising and falling in perfect synchronization with her steady 60-beat-per-minute pulse. "The invoice for your arrogance has finally come due, Eleanor," Jacqueline whispered, "and the federal government doesn't accept payment plans." "Jacqueline, no!" Eleanor wailed, reaching out one last time as the DCIS agent stepped forward to lift her off the floor. "You can't just walk away from us. We are your family." "You are a corporate liability that has been permanently liquidated," Jacqueline said. She turned her back on them, her movements sharp, disciplined, and entirely final. She didn't look back as Vivienne began to scream again, or as Thomas was forced into his coat by the marshals. The Vance family empire was officially reduced to ash, and she was already stepping out of the burn zone. As Jacqueline walked toward the heavy double doors leading out of the hearing room, a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out from the shadows near the security perimeter. He didn't wear a military uniform, nor did he wear a tailored Italian suit like Lawson or Thomas. He wore a simple, rugged charcoal gray jacket over a dark flannel shirt, his work boots clean but showing the clear signs of heavy manual labor. His face was weathered, with faint lines of permanent exhaustion around his eyes, but his posture was rock solid, radiating a quiet, unyielding strength that didn't need a title or an insignia to assert itself. This was David, her husband, a veteran firefighter with the Savannah Fire Department who had spent the last 7 years standing as an unbreakable wall between Jacqueline and the toxic fallout of her biological family. He didn't say a word as she approached. He didn't need to. He had stood in the back of the courtroom for the entire duration of the confrontation, a silent guardian who knew exactly when to let his wife fight her battles and when to provide the anchor she needed afterward. David stepped forward, his massive calloused hand reaching out to gently take her hand. His grip was warm, solid, and entirely safe, a stark contrast to the cold, calculating hands of the politicians and executives who filled the Grand Plaza. "Are we clear, Colonel?" David asked softly, a faint, supportive smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Jacqueline looked up at him, the icy, terrifying mask of Phoenix Sawan softening for the first time in hours. She squeezed his hand back, her fingers locking into his. "The objective has been secured, David," she said quietly. "The area is officially cleared." "Then let's go home," he replied simply. Together, hand in hand, they walked out of the high-security hearing room and into the main corridor of the Grand Plaza. The surrounding crowd of high-society elites parted before them like the Red Sea, their previous whispers of mockery turned into a silent, terrified reverence as they watched the woman who had just dismantled one of the largest logistics empires in the South walk away without a single backward glance. The fallout from the raid at the Grand Plaza Savannah was swift, brutal, and entirely public. Within 48 hours of the execution of the docks warrant, the federal government had systematically frozen every asset tied to Vance Global Logistics. The national news broadcasts were flooded with footage of Thomas and Vivienne Vance being led down the steps of the federal courthouse in chains, their faces shielded from the flashing cameras of the paparazzi they had once courted so aggressively. The prestigious riverfront estate, the very property they had tried to extort from Jacqueline to cover their tracks, was seized by the U.S. Marshals Service and scheduled for federal auction to pay off the millions in outstanding procurement fines. For Eleanor, the isolation was absolute. Because she had signed numerous corporate indemnity waivers prepared by Lawson over the years, she wasn't directly criminally indicted for the titanium counterfeit scheme, but she was left completely destitute. The corporate credit cards were deactivated, the luxury vehicles were repossessed, and the high society friends who had once clamored for invitations to her dinner parties vanished overnight, refusing to return her calls or acknowledge her presence in public. She was forced to move out of her historic mansion and into a small rented apartment on the outskirts of Atlanta, funded only by a minimal state pension that couldn't even cover the cost of her old wardrobe. The woman who had ruled Savannah's elite with an iron fist of social superiority was now just another forgotten face in the crowd, a broken parasite whose host had finally walked away. Inside the Federal Correctional Institution in Alabama, Vivian Vance sat in a gray prison uniform, her hands rough and her designer life a distant memory. Her husband, a shallow socialite who had married her solely for her corporate access, filed for divorce within 6 months of her sentencing, abandoning their infant daughter Chloe to the state foster care system rather than damage his own social standing. They had thought they were the ones controlling the board, completely unaware that Jacqueline had been playing a grandmaster game while they were busy cheating at checkers. 3 years passed. The name Vance Global Logistics had been completely scrubbed from the defense registry, replaced by highly efficient, transparent military supply networks designed and managed by the Strategic Air Command. In Washington, D.C., the morning sun broke through the clouds, illuminating the massive glass and steel structure of the National Air and Space Museum on the National Mall. The museum was quiet during the early weekday hours, the vast exhibition halls filled only with the faint, echoing murmurs of a few tourists and the historical weight of humanity's greatest aviation achievements. Walking through the central gallery, completely detached from the uniform and the metrics of military command, was Jacqueline. She wore an elegant, tailored, cream-colored trench coat over a simple dark dress, her long hair pinned up in a casual, sophisticated style. Her face was radiant, the permanent tension that had defined her features during her 15 years of cover completely gone. She looked younger, lighter, as if the heavy gravitational pull of her past had been entirely neutralized. Holding her left hand was David, dressed in a sharp navy blazer, his presence as steady and reassuring as it had always been. But it was the little girl holding Jacqueline's right hand that drew the focus of her attention. This was Chloe, Vivian's daughter. When the family collapsed and Chloe was abandoned by her father, Jacqueline didn't hesitate. She utilized her legal team and her immense personal resources to initiate an emergency adoption proceeding, rescuing the innocent child from the chaos of the foster system. She had pulled her niece out of the wreckage of the Vance family legacy, ensuring that the toxic cycle of parasitic arrogance would end with the previous generation. "Look, Auntie Jackie," Chloe chirped, her small finger pointing up at the massive black aircraft suspended from the ceiling above them. "It looks like a giant bird." Jacqueline stopped, looking up at the iconic angular silhouette of the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber hanging in the exhibition bay. The aircraft was a marvel of engineering, sleek, dark, and completely invisible to enemy radar until the moment its payload was delivered. It was a weapon designed to operate in absolute silence, executing its mission with flawless precision before disappearing back into the dark. "That's a very special plane, Chloe," Jacqueline said softly, kneeling down so she was at eye level with the 3-year-old girl. "It's designed to fly through the darkest nights without making a sound, so it can protect the people on the ground who need it most." "Is it scary?" Chloe asked, her big, innocent eyes looking from the dark bomber to Jacqueline's face. "Only to the people who are doing bad things," David chimed in, stepping up beside them and gently lifting Chloe onto his shoulders so she could get a better view of the cockpit canopy. "To the good guys, that plane looks like freedom." Jacqueline smiled, watching her husband laugh as Chloe reached out her tiny hands, trying to touch the wingtip of the historic aircraft. She felt a profound, absolute sense of peace settle deep into her chest. Her watch still tracked her vitals, but the metric was no longer a tactical necessity to maintain under emotional siege. Her heart rate was a calm, natural 60 beats per minute, not because she was holding back an explosion of anger, but because she was entirely, completely fulfilled. The family that had tried to destroy her was gone, their paper kingdom reduced to forgotten dust in a federal archive. She had survived the trenches of war, the betrayal of her own blood, and the toxic trap of high society, emerging not as a victim but as a conqueror who had defined her own terms of victory. As the morning light streamed through the massive glass pavilion of the museum, casting long, dramatic shadows of the historic aircraft across the floor, Jacqueline took David's hand once more. She looked up at the B-2 bomber one last time, recognizing her own reflection in the sleek, dark composite armor of the legendary warplane. Like the aircraft, she had operated in the shadows, bore the weight of impossible missions, and delivered justice with absolute, silent finality. But her mission was over now. The cover was lifted, the ledgers were balanced, and the assets were permanently secured. "Are you ready to go, Jackie?" David asked, his eyes filled with a deep, knowing warmth as he adjusted Chloe on his shoulders. Jacqueline looked at her husband, then looked up at the little girl who was laughing merrily, completely untouched by the malice and greed that had destroyed her biological parents. Chloe would grow up knowing what real love looked like. She would grow up surrounded by honor, integrity, and the unyielding protection of a real family. "Yes," Jacqueline said, her voice carrying the light, effortless melody of a woman who had finally stepped out of the cage. "I'm ready." They turned away from the historical displays, walking together toward the grand exit of the pavilion, stepping out into the bright, boundless warmth of the Washington sun. She didn't look back at the shadows behind her. She had no need for retroflective glances or lingering regrets. She was Jacqueline Mercer. She was Phoenix 01. And she was, at long last, completely, proudly, and absolutely free.
Every story teaches us something. Today's lesson is simple. Never judge someone's value by where they started. Judge them by what they overcame. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. See you in the next story.